Okay, so I believe we are live now. If you are watching, I'm sorry about the shaking of the camera. I have my laptop kind of perched on some stuff so the camera angle's a little bit better. And I have some questions that have already come in via Remind. And if you are watching this live on YouTube, there's a chat box off to the right-hand side that I can see. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in there. This study session will run from 5 until 7 or until I run out of questions, whichever one happens first. I'll be frank, I've never actually had a study session go for 2 hours before, but they do usually last for at least an hour or so. So if you have questions, this is the time to get out your Unit 1 study guide and to go over and to look at terms that you don't understand, and feel free to go ahead and ask. A couple of things I do want to address before we get going. First of all, these study sessions are meant to help clarify questions that you have, to go over concepts that you find confusing, but it's not meant to be me reteaching the entirety of the unit. So please don't say, can you explain chapter 1 of the O'Neill reading? No, that's not going to happen. And if you want me to go over individual Harkness readings, you need to have specific questions about the Harkness readings. This really needs to be something where you guys take some responsibility for your learning and ask targeted questions, and I'd be more than happy to drill in with those questions once you come up with them. The other thing I will point out is that I believe we have some storms coming through, so if I freeze up for a moment or something like that, it's probably the Wi-Fi on my end. It looks like we've got some pretty nasty thunderstorms coming our direction in the next couple of hours, so do be aware of that. This particular video will archive automatically on YouTube, and it will be up and visible for you guys on the blog as often as you guys like it. You can watch it tomorrow as you review for your test on Tuesday. It is also going to be there throughout the year in case you need to review before you take your final, okay? Or the final, not the final, excuse me, my apologies, before you take your AP exam. So it will be up there as well. Your test on Tuesday will be in the same format as all AP exams for this course. There will be 55 multiple choice questions with 5 answers, A, B, C, D, E. They tend to be pretty straightforward multiple choice questions. I will put in a few that require you to look at data or look at graphs, because there are always a few on the AP exam that do that. Your exam, your unit exam will cover everything from all of the textbook readings from the packet that I assigned, regardless of whether or not I talked about the content. It is still fair game. The other thing that I would remind you of is that I will ask you some questions about the Harkness readings. Central arguments tend to be kind of what I go for. And additionally, anything that we discussed in class that was not part of the readings is still fair game. So basically, you need to go over all of your notes, all of your readings, and make sure you're up to date. If you're struggling with how to go ahead and do that, a couple of things I would point you in the direction of. First of all, pause for just a second while I share my desktop with you guys here. That is something that I can do. So hang on. Okay, I want to screen share. You're going to get a weird, like, sort of infinite mirror version here for a moment. I'm sorry. Let me present to everybody. Okay. All right. I know it's scary there. Okay. So here is what I want to show you. On the blog, if you go across the top band here, you'll see the Unit Study Materials tab. If you click on the tab for Introduction Materials, it has everything that we have kind of talked about this unit in terms of syllabus, instructions, reading packet, Unit 1 study guide. You can go there if you need a new copy of it. And also this right here, which I'm not sure many of you have figured out exists yet. This right here is the companion website to the text that I am using for your reading packet. Some of you, I believe, found it for the quiz, which was very good of you, very lucky. And some of you, I feel, have not yet found it. Now, one thing I will point out to you that is very useful is if you click on individual chapters and you go to chapter quizzes and click on it, you can click on this and say how many questions you want to go for. You always want to take the most of them. And it has questions here that come directly from the readings that we've done this unit. I'm not saying that I use some of these questions. I'm just saying they're a very good review option. Yeah, I would do the quizzes, okay? Especially if you struggled on the first quiz for this unit. So with that in mind, I'm going to jump back over here and turn off my screen share options. Okay, stop presenting. There we go. Okay, so we should be back to me online here. And if you have questions and you're watching on YouTube, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to start answering questions that I've seen on Remind. So forgive me if I look like I'm looking down and not at the camera. What I'm doing is I'm checking my various devices. I have my tablet here and I also have my cell phone. And I'm checking them for things on Twitter and things on Remind so that I can see whether or not you guys have questions. So I'm going to kind of back it up and I'm going to look and see what questions you guys have had so far. So let's see here. I'm going to start with some questions that Brianna had. So Brianna, if you are watching live or on the video later, these are the questions that you had. So I'm going to read them aloud and then I'll address them in order, okay? So if you have questions, I do promise I will get to them. You might just have to be patient and wait. So Liana, thank you for asking a question on the chat. I will get to you after I address Brianna's here. So Brianna asked, what are the best things to take away from the Harkness readings, especially from the third set? What is the difference between norms and values? And can I explain public policy, social research, and political behavior? I can do all of those things for you, Brianna. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to tell you about the Harkness readings is that I'm not going to ask very sort of nuanced questions about, analysis of the articles for the most part. I'm going to mostly ask that you be able to identify central argument and match them to the correct author. That's really all I'm going for here, is can you identify where the argument is coming from? So nothing really more complex than that. Generally speaking, the AP exam is not really going to get a lot into theorists. That is something that I'm adding in here so that this course is a little bit more useful to you if you choose to take a poli-sci course in the future. Comparative politics as an exam and a testing area for College Board is a very, very, very small test. It's only about 20,000 people around the world every year take this test. And that means that College Board doesn't make a whole lot of money off of it. So they don't put a lot of resources into this test. And as a result of that, that can mean that sometimes universities aren't really sure that they want to give credit for this course. Don't think that means that I think you shouldn't take the exam. I think you should take the exam. And the reason I think you should take the exam is because if you show your university what we've covered in this class, if you save our readings, if you bring the syllabus that I created to your professors, they ought to recognize that the difficulty level, the rigor of this course is right where it needs to be for an introductory poli-sci class. So that's part of the reason why I do this. So for your Harkness discussions, what I'm trying to do is to expose you to the ideas and major theorists associated with introductory poli-sci. So all I'm going to do on the test here is really ask that you be able to identify the central arguments that are being made. So nothing more complex than that, Brianna. To your second question, Brianna, you asked what are the difference between norms and values? Frequently, we use those terms interchangeably, at least in political science. In sociology and in psychology, the terms may be used differently. But when we say things are norms, we mean that they occur frequently enough within a society to not be seen as outside of the bounds of common behavior. Okay, if something is a norm, it is common. It occurs frequently within the values. I shouldn't use that term right there. Within the accepted behaviors of a society. Okay. So generally speaking, if you think about like the classroom, a norm of the classroom would be, if I ask a question, a norm is that generally speaking, you look around and see if like no one else is speaking, maybe then you speak up without raising your hand. But if it looks like someone else is talking, you should probably raise your hand, right? That's just kind of a norm. A value is an assessment of something that the culture or society finds important. And this could be religious, it could be something about morality, but it is an expression of something that is important to that culture. So a norm is something that is within the realm of common behavior. Value is something that is seen as important. Often the two coincide. The two frequently are used to justify one and the other. So hopefully that clarifies a bit. Don't worry about digging too far into the nuance there. This isn't a sociology course, right? So primarily when we use those terms, we'll use them paired. Okay. And then the third question that Brianna had was, can I explain public policy, social research, and political behavior? Yes, I can. Yeah, I'll go ahead and do it. So public policy is essentially any sort of action that is established to guide public behavior in some sort of way. And generally speaking, in our society, in the United States, we view that through regulation, rulemaking, or lawmaking. That is public policy. This is what Dr. Roach was starting to get into on Friday when she had you guys do your supply and demand activity, and she was talking about policy making at the very end. So policy making is essentially the practice of freezing power in positions to guide behaviors. That's what it is. If you watch that video that we watched about power earlier this unit, if you watch it, the author says that policy is power frozen. That is, policy is where people decide how they want to express their power, and they create laws or regulations or rules that force power to flow in certain directions. So, for example, something that is an example of modern policy making would be something like the recent tax cuts that were passed last year by Congress. That is an example of policy making. Another form of policy making could be a regulatory agency such as the FDA saying that, I don't know, Kraft has got to cut back on the amount of acceptable spider parts that is allowed in food. Believe it or not, that's actually a regulation there. Like there's an acceptable maximum amount of spiders that can be in your food. I know that really grosses people out, but it's true. So those are examples of policy making. So I hope that helps with policy making, Brianna. The third part she was asking about here is social research. My apologies, I can't speak right now. So social research is a branch of research that really kind of changed the way we approached poli-sci starting in the 1960s and 1970s. Okay. So prior to the 1960s, most political science research was extremely conservative in that it really focused in on Western European case studies, didn't really look at the rest of the world. It operated on sort of modernization theory, which is the assumption that given enough time, all governmental structures will move towards a democratic structure. Okay. And it also tended to be rather uncritical of that notion that it kind of assumed that there was this inevitable positive upswing in terms of political development. And it really didn't look at individuals as part of the political process as such. Instead, it tended to focus primarily on the deeds of states, big aggregates, not individuals. In the 1960s and 1970s, what you see is a push towards something called behavioral theory. And behavioral theory primarily looked at the fields of sociology and psychology and said, okay, if we're starting to understand how the human mind and how psychology impacts human behavior, then wouldn't it make sense that people's political decisions and therefore political science as a whole is therefore impacted by social forces? And this prompted a new wing of research in political science, and this is called social research. So instead of just kind of talking about political decisions being made on the assumption that everybody behaves in a rational way all the time, and that all political systems will eventually move towards the end goal of democracy, on this kind of like grand westernized sort of theory. Social research says, no, people are more complicated than that. And we behave in ways that are predicated by our sociology and our psychology, that we have to look at both macro and micro causes in terms of how and why we behave. And social research really did a lot to start shifting towards the difference between individual behavior and crowd behavior and how that can influence public policy making and politics as a whole. So that's kind of where social research went. And today I would say that we really see a lot more social research in terms of trying to figure out what influences politics than, say, other forms of research. I think people are really interested in kind of looking at the sociological and psychological reasons behind political behavior today. So, Brianna, those are your 3 questions. I hope that helps. Liana, I'm going to address yours now since you're the first one in the chat, and then I'm going to bounce back to Remind and see what the next question I have in Remind is. So Liana says, how do the terms dark ages in China relate to the structures, state, and power section of the vocabulary? Liana, if you go back and you look at your notes, okay, look back at your notes and you will see that when we talked about the origins of the state, your author for the textbook, Patrick O'Neill, basically he makes this argument, and it's a very classic political science argument, that the state originates in Western Europe. The modern state originates in Western Europe after the fall of Rome. And that essentially what happens is that with the absence of the political entity of the Roman Empire, there was anarchy in Western Europe. I do not agree with this point of view. I disagree with this argument. I think there's lots to say that it's very Eurocentric, but regardless, it is the dominant theory in political science, and you should be aware of it. That this anarchy, this conflict that existed between various groups, required the creation of the strong central state because it would allow for the claiming of land and the protection and sovereignty thereof. I'm not entirely convinced by this. I think it is entirely possible, to make the argument that the modern state really started in China. If you think about the characteristics of a modern state is sovereign, right? It is able to make decisions which apply to its own territory. It is able to exert force within that own territory, and it has boundaries that are well established. All of those things are true about like the Han Dynasty in China. So I put in China there because I do want you to think critically about whether or not the notion that the state really begins in the West is an accurate one. Okay, so let me see here. I have got some other questions that have popped up here. Let me check and see which ones I want to do. Okay, I've got some questions from Grace here. So Grace says, Ms. Galloway, can you discuss the major limitations to the study of comparative politics? It's question number 2 on the study guide under Introductive to Comparative Methodology. Thank you. All right, so Grace, yes, I can I can discuss those limitations. However, I could also say, and here is where I'm going to share my screen again, so it's going to do super weird things. My apologies, guys. It's going to look like you're falling down a rabbit hole, okay? So here you go. Scary. Okay. So here is the thing that I want to point out to you about those questions about major limitations to comparative politics. If you go through your reading packet, remember when I had you make those posters of limitations to comparative politics and the comparative methodology? It came directly out of your reading. So first major limitation to comparative methodology is the difficulty in controlling variables. There it is, right there. Second major limitation is, dun, 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 the interactions between variables themselves, thus multi-causality. Okay, third major one, limitations to information gathering. Like if you do not speak Korean and you are trying to get information on Korea, that's really hard. Fourth major problem, access to case studies. Like it is hard to get data in China. Like that is just a true thing to consider. Fifth major thing, regions. Like I speak Spanish. Therefore, if I'm going to do political science research, I'm probably going to research areas that speak Spanish. I'm probably not going to study Russia because unfortunately I do not speak Russian except for to say da, niet, and spasibo. That's it. So this means that people tend to focus in on area studies, right? There's also selection bias in that the way that we go about selecting our case studies can also be a major limitation. And then the seventh one here is really trying to figure out cause and effect and the problems of endogeneity, right? So all of those are the major limitations that we need to consider when we're thinking about our case studies here. Okay, sorry, we're falling down the rabbit hole again. Stop. Okay. So those right there are some of the major limitations, Grace, so I hope that helps a little bit. I'm going to jump back into the chat now and see what questions I've got going on here. Okay, so Rebecca, I see that you want me to explain teleology. So teleology is the notion that we build an argument with the end in mind. If an argument is teleological, essentially what that means is that I've already determined what point I want to make, and then I backtrack from that point to build everything towards it. This can be a real problem in terms of, especially in scientific research. If you know what point you want to make, and then you're trying to build your research to fit that, that can really be an issue. But in the context of this course, when we talked about teleology, we were broadly talking about it within the context of bear with me, I'm blanking for a second here. We were broadly talking about it in the context of institutional stickiness. Why do institutions exist? And I told you one reason why institutions may exist is because what we're trying to do is we create institutions with the end in mind. We're creating institutions with the goal of trying to do something. That is essentially teleological. My apologies. My wording ain't real good right now. So there's this notion that like, if we are trying to prevent our food from having like too many spider parts in it, right, we might create the FDA and say your job here is to regulate food or drugs and that sort of stuff. And that's a teleological goal, right? We create an institution with a goal in mind. So Rebecca, that's really all that I was meaning when I put in that term. It's just that I know it's a confusing one, and it does show up later on during this course. So it's a helpful thing for you to know what that is. Let's see here. Mallory, can I explain path dependence? Oh my goodness. I would be more than happy to explain path dependence because this is a term that I will use all the time. And it tends to be something that is kind of confusing to you guys. And I usually have to explain it more than once. So yes, give me half a second. Let me take a drink of water here. Okay. Okay. So path dependence is essentially the notion that depending on the institutions that you have, you or individuals are more likely to engage in certain political behaviors than others. So I'm trying to think of something physical I can use as an example. Unfortunately, I don't think I have anything fun that I can play with here. I'm sorry. So essentially, the notion is that if you build an institution that, and the institution could be, say, a protection of rights or something like that. Like, let's say here we have freedom of speech. Okay, we have the institution of freedom of speech, right? This notion that individuals have the right to self-expression. Okay, which is true in the United States. So over here, we have freedom of speech, but we also have the notion in the United States that the government derives its power from the people, right? So the people are the source of power. You know, it says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. That's the beginning of our Constitution. So we have the notion that power is derived from the people. And we also have the notion of freedom of speech, okay? Because of those two notions, what's going to happen is you're likely to see people express themselves within the bounds of those two institutions. People will feel fairly comfortable expressing political views in public without having to go and be anonymous, usually because they feel like they have freedom of speech that's protected. So they will express themselves, they will engage in that political behavior. Additionally, because there's this notion that people understand that government comes from the people, not from some other source, then people will feel that they have an obligation to engage in their government. And so that means that there's this normal range of political behaviors that people will engage in. That is essentially the path people will follow. Thus, when you have institutions in place, people are likely to follow that path dependence. If you remember the Zinn article that you read, it was the second article that you read. It was on the first Harkness discussion. Zinn talks a little bit about path dependence, although he doesn't call it that. He says when people engage in politics, we assume that there are a certain number of answers that we can consider, A, B, C, D, E, but we don't think of anything beyond that. We don't think of like, you know, G, H, I, J, K, because those are outside the bounds. Essentially, they're outside the path. So path dependence is where our institutions exist. We usually operate within those institutions and not outside of them. Doesn't mean we can't, just means we're less likely to. So when we analyze the political behavior of various case studies this year, it's important for us to think about what institutions exist, because if a place doesn't have strong protection of freedom of speech, or if a place has lots and lots of free and independent newspapers, you're likely to see people express themselves very differently and behave differently in a political sense based on those institutions. Okay, so that's what we mean by by path dependence. So hopefully that helps, Mallory. If it doesn't, please let me know in the chat and I will get back to that. All right, I have some more questions that I'm going to pull up on Remind here to make sure that I'm getting to everybody. So let's see here. Let me get to Spencer. Okay, so Spencer has some questions here. Okay, so he has... Okay, he has 4 questions in here. So let me go ahead and read them, okay? So his first question is, what would you say is the most important for us to know about David Easton? How would you explain performative meaning and joint action theory? What are the primary differences between spectrum analysis and circular analysis? How could systems theory be used in political science and comparative politics? And then he wants to know my YouTube channel, which I've sent out. Yeah, so this is it. Okay, it's nothing fun. It's just my name. All right, so here we go. Spencer, the first thing I would say about the important thing for you to know about David Easton is he's the guy who had that really complex model of essentially how power influenced policymaking. He's the one who had stuff about inputs, outputs, feedback, and decision making, right? So you start with a decision and that results in an output, which results in feedback, which results in more inputs. And basically the most important thing I would say about Easton is that his notion is that if you don't have enough positive input, the system will collapse. If you have too many demands upon the system in terms of like people rejecting the decisions that are made or not or providing negative feedback, it will sort of create a cascading systems failure. That's really what I would talk about with regards to Easton. He's pretty straightforward there. So make sure that you look back in your notes on that circular flow that I showed you guys. That's really where I would focus. The second major question that Spencer had here was, would I explain performative meaning and joint action theory? Okay, so joint action theory actually connects to Rebecca's earlier question about teleology, because joint action theory is the idea that institutions exist and are sticky because we have this notion of what we want them to create at the end, that teleological notion. That's joint action theory. So joint action theory is we're going to create this institution that does thing X, and I'm going to give it my support either because it benefits me directly, and that's sort of a self-motivated reason for my supporting this particular institution, or because I have some sort of altruistic notion that by supporting thing X, I am going to be able to see everybody benefit, and that indirectly benefits me. Okay, so that's joint action theory. All I'm looking for is for you to understand why institutions stick around. That's really the only thing there, Spencer, that you need to pay attention to. Performative meaning. Performative meaning is where things only have meaning so long as we perform them. Yeah. So if there's a keep out sign on your sibling's bedroom door and you bust on through, then that sign has no meaning. If you do in fact keep out, it does have meaning, right? So institutions have meaning so long as we perform the act of believing that they do, right? So the rule of law matters so long as we perform the act of making sure that rule of law matters. Like if I say that the law applies to me, and I think then that it doesn't apply to Spencer because I like Spencer, then the rule of law clearly doesn't matter at all, right? Because rule of law means that the law applies no matter what, in all circumstances, to all people, at all times. That's what that means. Okay, one last question from Spencer, and then I'm going to jump back to the chat. Let's see here. He wants to know, let's see here, primary differences between spectrum analysis and circular analysis. Essentially, when I say spectrum analysis, I mean that it is laid out on a straight line. Think about the way that we originally laid out our analysis of political attitudes, right? Where we had radicals on the far left and then we had reactionaries on the far right. A circular analysis is where we lay them out almost in quadrants and then we can see the flow from one to another. It's just a way of thinking about different political attitudes. Okay, just know those terms there. It can be a useful thing to do. And how could systems theory be used in political science and comparative politics? I've actually kind of I've already answered that question when I talked about Easton. So I'm going to move on from here. So let me see here. Morgan, I'm going to hit up you on your question. What is the difference between a fragile state and a weak state? Okay, so the primary difference between a weak state and a fragile state is it basically goes strong. You have a strong state, they have a high degree of capacity to, a healthy degree of capacity. Let's go with that. They have a healthy degree of capacity. They can get things done. They can keep the lights on. Basically, that's a strong state. And they have a healthy degree of autonomy. They are able to operate without significant sort of bowing down to other groups of people, be it the outside world or the public within their country, within their country's borders. So that's a strong state. The United States is a strong state. So too is the UK. Germany is a strong state. Let's see here. Canada. Canada is a strong state. A weak state is a state that has a problem in one or more of those sort of areas with regards to capacity or autonomy. So there might be armed rebels who vie for control of the state. That usually is an indicator that you got a weak state in hand. You might not be able to keep the lights on. That can be an indicator that you've got a weak state. Maybe you can't collect taxes effectively. But beyond those things, broadly, the day-to-day aspects of the state keep running. That's a weak state. So Greece is a weak state. They have a really hard time collecting taxes, and as a result, their infrastructure is meh. I would say Mexico, unfortunately, has a real problem because of political violence and sort of an armed, counterinsurgency in some places directly against the state that they can't put down. Be it through cartels or the EZLN, which we'll talk about later. But because of this, I would say that the Mexican state is currently technically classified as a weak state. until they can get those violence problems under control, that's where they are. A fragile state is where you have more than one of those problems. Maybe they compound. Maybe you are teetering on the brink of failed state status. That's a fragile state. So I would say currently Venezuela is a fragile state. Venezuela is really hurting in terms of its infrastructure, its economic ability, its ability to, control the population. And if it tilts a little bit more, you're looking at the far end of the spectrum, which is failed state status. Failed state status is where the state is not able to exert either capacity or autonomy. It really has no control over its own borders. South Sudan is a really good example of that. Yeah. Syria. Yeah. Afghanistan in some cases, although I don't know. Afghanistan is further down the spectrum from fragile to failed, I think, than Venezuela, but not by all that much. Okay. So Morgan, I hope that helps. Let's see here. Lindsay wants to know, in my explanation of path dependence, could I include examples? So Lindsay, I think I did earlier on when I was explaining path dependence, but if you need more, let me think here. Okay, so a good example of path dependence in China. China is deeply influenced by the institutions of sort of filial piety and cultural and sort of respect for one's elders that comes out of Confucianism, right? Religious institutions and belief systems are in fact institutions, right? So Confucianism is an institution that deeply influences sort of both the political norms in China as well as the cultural life of people in China. And as a result of this, that shapes in a lot of ways people's political behavior. The notion of not being confrontational, particularly to those who are older than you or are in higher positions of power than you, is really common in China. And this means that, generally speaking, political criticism kind of goes behind the scenes. It doesn't really have an outlet in the same sort of ways that it does in the United States. That's an example of path dependence. Because of the institutions that exist, certain political behaviors are more or less likely. Okay, let's jump in here to Coleman really quickly. I've already addressed yours, Coleman, so hopefully you're okay with that. And now I'm going to jump back over to Remind and see what questions I have there. Let's see here. Okay. Let's see, I've done Spencer's. Let's look and see what Tara has. Okay, so Tara wants to know, could I explain the difference between autonomy and capacity again? She says she's looked through her notes and she's still a little confused. Okay, so autonomy is the ability of a state to behave independently of either the public or outside pressures from outside of its borders. That is, it is autonomous. I know I'm defining the term with itself here. It is able to act on its own. Okay, it's able to act on its own. And that means that the state and the government are able to do things without having to constantly listen to feedback that's coming in. Now, some degree of autonomy is good. You don't really want to be a state that has to listen to the outside world constantly, right? It would be a really bad thing for the United States to have to turn to Canada and be like, y'all okay with this, before we made any sort of policy decision. It's not really good. It's also really not good when countries have to do the same thing and check in with the United States. When we get to Iran, when we talk about the Iranian Revolution of 79, one of the major problems there is that the government in place at the time really didn't have a strong grasp of autonomy. They didn't listen to the public very much, which generally is an indication of high degrees of autonomy, but they also were almost entirely kind of beholden to foreign policy dictates from the United States. And that was really harmful too, because it meant that the Shah kept listening to various US administrations rather than thinking about what was best domestically for his people. And that essentially broke the relationship between the Shah and the Iranian public as a whole. So that was a real problem, okay? So if you have too much autonomy, you don't listen to the public at all, and that can be very dangerous. And if you have too little autonomy, you don't listen to the feedback that people sorry, if you have too much autonomy, you don't listen to the public and you don't listen to their feedback. If you have too little autonomy, you only do what other people tell you. So you want to kind of find that happy medium, the place where you can actually get things done with listening to a healthy degree of criticism without having to be beholden to someone else. Capacity is the ability to do stuff, okay? If you have capacity, you are capable, right? So having a high degree of capacity means that you are able to do the basic things a state has to do to maintain control, right? You have to be able to maintain control of your borders. You have to be able to keep the lights on, collect taxes, to run government relatively effectively, whatever that government structure looks like. So the United States broadly has a fair degree of capacity, although we have less capacity than a place like Norway or Singapore. Their government structure is very different, and they've created a state that is much stronger in a lot of ways. That's largely because it relies on social democratic principles, that is, socialist principles. And this results in a stronger and larger and more involved national government than the United States national government is. Okay. Let me see here. So Tara, if that doesn't help, please do let me know, and I'd be glad to give you a little bit more feedback on that. Morgan also has a question on the chat. Hang on, let me read it. Okay, Morgan wants to know, will I also explain the difference between inductive reasoning and qualitative methods? Does inductive reasoning fall under qualitative methods? It can, it doesn't have to. Inductive reasoning is essentially where you pose your research question. Why I can't talk. Why does democracy as a governmental system develop in some places but not in others? That's my research question, okay? And then what you do once you've created your research question, right, is you have to choose your methodology. So here they're going to do an inductive reasoning, okay? So once I have my research question, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig in and I'm going to look at maybe one central case study, okay? Or I'm going to look really deeply at maybe one or two countries. So I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to look at a country that didn't develop democracy. I'm going to look at North Korea. And I'm going to dig into North Korea as deeply as I possibly can to understand why it didn't develop democracy. And then once I have come up with my reasoning as to why North Korea didn't develop democracy, then I'm going to create a hypothesis based off of that deep dive case study. Then I'm going to take that hypothesis and then I will go out and look for broad responses to it. Okay, that's inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning does tend to correlate with qualitative research. Okay, quantitative research, remember, is where you look at data. Okay, it's primarily data, hard numbers, that sort of stuff. Taxation records, voting rights sort of stuff, like not voting rights, but like voting rates and participation, where you get the aggregate data together and you try to get as much data together as you possibly can. Now, inductive research can use data. It totally can. Like you could go to North Korea and if you have some sort of magical connection to the Kim family, actually get tables of data and try to pull things out of it, okay? Or it could also involve, because you're in one place and diving as deep as you can, inductive reasoning could also involve qualitative methodology, like interviews or sort of, like an interview sort of structure where you do commentary on the data, that sort of stuff. That's more common. But just because you have inductive methodology doesn't mean that you are bound and determined to use qualitative methods. That doesn't it doesn't follow necessarily. You can do a deductive study of something and also use qualitative methodology. It is more likely that inductive research is going to be qualitative, and it is more likely that deductive research is going to be quantitative, but it doesn't have to be. So be very careful in the usage of those terms and make sure that you understand the difference there. Let's see here. Tessa wants to know, do you need to know examples of fragile, weak, and failed states? No, you don't necessarily need examples. What you you don't, that doesn't make any sense. What you do need are, let's see here, the ability to look at some data, maybe, or descriptions, and to determine whether or not a state is failed, or strong, or fragile, or weak. Okay, so Tessa, that's what I would focus in on. You don't need to be able to give me examples, although it is useful for you to know some, but you certainly don't need to. Okay, let me pull back up my remind here because I think I've gotten through all of the questions on the chat here. So if you have questions on chat, go ahead and answer, put them in so I can come back to them. Let's see here. Okay. All right, Samaya wants me to address the difference between parliamentary and presidential democracies. Okay, and actually, we're going to go into this a little bit more next unit, but I do believe that since we were talking about the United States towards the end of this unit, pardon me, my apologies, guys. Wearing these headsets makes my ears always itch. Okay, so Samaya wants to know the difference between parliamentary and presidential democracies. And we will get into this more next unit. But since we did end talking about the United States, I'll go ahead and kind of give you the short answer to it. So don't expect there to be a lot in the way of questions about this. Yeah. So a presidential democracy is one where the head of state and head of government is combined into one role, usually, and that is the president. So here in the United States, the head of state, the person who represents the state, is the same person who runs the government, okay? In other places, particularly under parliamentary systems or mixed presidential systems, that is not the case, like the UK. In the UK, the head of state is Queen Elizabeth II. Do not forget the second part, that matters. And the head of government is currently Prime Minister Theresa May, although who knows how long that might last. It could shortly be Jeremy Corbyn. We'll find out, okay? So at any rate, the thing is that in a presidential system, the president is directly elected in some regard by the public. That means we go to the ballot box and we check off a name in some way for that person to be president, to be head of state and head of government. In a parliamentary system, that is not at all how the head of government is chosen. The head of government is chosen by the majority party in parliament. Nobody goes to the ballot box and votes for Theresa May. Instead, you vote for your local representative, your local member of parliament, who happens to be a member of a certain party, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, Democratic Unionist Party out of Northern Ireland, Scottish Nationalist Party, whatever. And whatever party has the majority in Parliament, they get to choose the Prime Minister. That's how it goes. So in a parliamentary democracy, the major difference is that the head of government is not chosen directly by the people. The presidential system, the head of government is. Okay, that's the big difference. But we will get into this more next unit, I promise. Okay, let's see here. Samaya also wants to know, can I go over the Harkness articles? And I did respond and told her that she needed to ask specific questions. But remember, try to focus in on the center arguments of each piece. Try to figure out what the thesis statement for each argument, for each article is. Be able to think about any major conflicts between pieces that I gave you. Particularly the third one, I think you guys were interested in that with regards to the notion of the tyranny of the majority, tyranny of the minority, and who actually governs the political and apolitical strata. Make sure that you read those carefully, the de Tocqueville and Dahl pieces. Let's see here. And Claire has some questions. Good, excellent. Okay, so I have some questions here from Claire, and then I have some questions from Priyanka, and I don't have any other questions showing up in chat. So I'm just going to remind you that when I run out of questions, we are done, okay? So right now I have questions from Claire and Priyanka, and I don't have any others. And once we're done with questions, then I'm going to turn this baby off, okay? Because I got things to do, and you got things to do, and we all got things to do, okay? So Claire says, how can non-democratic regimes be decentralized? I'm going to have to think about that in a moment because I'm not sure I understand what she's asking. Can I re-explain the different parts of systems theory? Why did Europe get credited with being the first modern state and not China? What was the Treaty of Westphalia and why was it important? Okay, so some of those questions I've already addressed in earlier parts of this video. So Claire, if you're concerned about Easton systems theory, go back to like the first half hour or so of this study session. I definitely talk about it there. Why did Europe get credited with being the first modern state and not China? I'm going to be straight up and say I think that that's a Eurocentric bias in terms of the people who were originally writing the discipline of poli-sci. Political science as a discipline really develops in Western circles in terms of like thinking about political theory following the French Revolution. I mean, the French Revolution was so disruptive in Western Europe that it really prompted people to think about how politics works and why people make the decisions they do. And the post-French Revolutionary period, particularly after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, was a deeply conservative Europe that was moving towards imperialism in a large-scale way. And as a result of that, I think it tended to embody sort of some of the best and worst aspects of Western Europe in the 19th century, including racism. So I think part of the answer as to why is Europe seen as the birthplace of the modern state and not China, I think it does have to come down to the notion that the people who were writing the discipline were European and therefore were expressing their own sort of, whether or not they were aware of it, their own biases and their own expressions of privilege. And I think also there's an inherent racism to the early 19th century discipline of poli-sci that really can't be ignored. So yeah, I think that's one thing to consider. Okay, Tessa, thank you for asking more questions. I appreciate it. Let's see here. The other question that Claire asked that I think is really important that nobody else has asked so far is, what is the Treaty of Westphalia and why is it important? And I'm probably mispronouncing that, but hang on a second. Okay. So the Treaty of Westphalia is a treaty that developed following the Protestant Reformation in the Germanic states, sort of the craziness that was the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century into the 17th century. And there were about 100 years following, about 1715 or so, maybe a little bit earlier than that, that were characterized by constant warfare between Protestant groups and Catholic groups within the Germanic states. And because the closer you were to Rome, the more likely you were to be Catholic, and the farther away from it, the more likely you were to be Protestant. Not all of the Germanic states were practicing the same Christian faith, and this resulted in a lot of conflict. So ultimately, what you had developed was the Treaty of Westphalia, which established the notion that princes within their own principalities and kingdoms had the right to establish their religious practice of that kingdom or principality, and no other prince could change the religious rule within that area. Essentially, it was the legal expression of the idea of sovereignty, that within the border of one's kingdom or principality, whatever a prince said went, and they had the right to express that. And it is essentially the foundation of the Western European idea of sovereignty. So that's why the Treaty of Westphalia is important, okay? Let's see here. I see. Oh, good. So Tessa, Harrison, and Chike have questions. Claire, I'm not understanding the first question that you asked. I'm so sorry. Ask me tomorrow in class, and I would be more than happy to talk it out with you. But I think it might have been a bit of a typo when you were texting it to me. So do ask me again later, okay, honey? Tessa asked, can I explain the difference between a liberal and illiberal democracy? Yay! Yes, I totally can. Additionally, liberal and illiberal democracies are going to be where we begin next unit. We are going to dig into this really, really deep. Okay, so a liberal democracy, if you remember when we talked about what liberalism was in terms of a political ideology, liberalism is a political ideology that emphasizes individual freedoms as the primacy of everything in government, right? That if you have to answer the question freedom or equality, the answer is freedom. That's what liberalism is based upon. So a liberal democracy is one in which the rights and privileges of the individual are paramount. That means a liberal democratic system emphasizes usually individuals' rights to own property, individuals' rights to freedom of speech and expression. It tends to emphasize things like religious freedom, press freedom, freedom of assembly, all of the good stuff, or I think it's good stuff. I'm kind of a fan of it, that winds up in the First Amendment. That's a liberal democracy. And liberal democracies are largely sort of the thing that comes out of the late 18th century, early 19th century. And they really were kind of what we assumed that all government structures were moving towards up until, the 1950s or so. An illiberal democracy is one that denies the principles of liberalism and yet claims the mantle of democracy. That sounds really weird, but essentially what it does is maybe it is a system that allows for voting, but also constrains public speech, or it allows for voting from some people, but not all people. Okay, so I would say South Africa during the era of apartheid was an illiberal democracy. People voted, they had a representative government structure. It had democratic principles at its heart, and yet the vast majority of people in South Africa were disenfranchised, right? That would be an illiberal democracy. You could make the claim that the United States at various points in its own history has been illiberal in terms of its voting rights. I would say in large degree, Russia is shifting towards an illiberal democratic structure. The elections that have been held in Russia since 2012 have been broadly fraudulent. There have been widespread cases of ballot box stuffing, all sorts of stuff, voter suppression acts, that sort of thing, and that leads to an illiberal democratic structure. The DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, obviously they claim the notion of democracy in their very name of their state, and yet it is not. China has elections. People vote in China, but the choices are extremely limited, right? The only people who can vote really are members of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And so if you're not a member of the Chinese Communist Party, you really don't have that much of a say. So in that regard, that's an illiberal democracy. So we're going to dig more into this later on, Tessa, but hopefully that clarifies things a little bit for you. Really, I only brought it up this unit because of when we talked about liberalism. Okay, that's really the connection. So let's see here. I'm going to jump back, I think, to Priyanka's questions here. And then Harrison and Chike will round out with you. So let's see here. Priyanka wants to know, what are some examples of different forms that power can take? Can I explain the difference between reactionaries and radicals? What is the difference between cooperative and dual federalism? Those are all good questions, Priyanka. So the first question she asked here was, what are some different forms that power can take? If you go to here, I'm going to share my screen again, and it's going to be super weird. So apologies. This is where you get to see things do its telescoping thing again. Okay, share. Present to everybody. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if you go again to the Unit Study Materials tab here and you click on Introduction Materials, this is what you will see. And if you scroll down, I put up videos that I think will be useful for you. And so there are some of the crash course videos on the nature of war and human nature. This does kind of a good job of talking about war and the creation of the state and the difference between, say, Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau's version of human nature. Those are totally worth watching again if you haven't watched them already. And then the other thing I would point out is this right here. What is power? Remember, we watched this when we were talking about power, authority, and legitimacy. And in it, Leo talks about 6 major sources of power. And the major sources of power that he comes up with are, hang on, let's see here. Are we back to me? I think we're back to me. Let me double check. Okay, we should be. The 6 major sources of power that he comes up with are essentially the power of force. Yes, okay, good. Power of force, power of numbers, public policy making is a form of power. Money is, of course, power. We all know this. Ideas as a source of power, and I can't remember what the 6th one is. Watch the video to find out. But remember that power comes from a lot of different sources, right? Okay. And let's see here. Priyanka also has a question of, can I explain the difference between reactionaries and radicals? Okay. So remember, what we're talking about here with reactionaries, radicals, and liberals and conservatives, it's a question primarily about political attitudes. And political attitudes are really about how people feel about change, the scope of change, and how quickly it should occur. All right. So both radicals and reactionaries believe that change needs to occur very, very quickly. They're essentially saying that the system is broken in some regard. Okay. And it cannot be remade. So we have to burn the whole thing down. But where radicals say, burn the whole thing down, throw the baby out with the bathwater, there's nothing worth saving in this system. Radicals say, we are going to come up with something totally new. We're going to do what the French revolutionaries do under Robespierre and rewrite time. We're going to get rid of the Catholic Church. We're going to instead worship rationality and math. And we're going to really kind of like dig into this brand new way of thinking about things. Reactionaries, on the other hand, say, yeah, we need to throw everything out, burn it all down. There is nothing here that we can save. And instead, we need to go back this way. There was better stuff that we were doing in the past, and we need to do that again. So there are similarities between radicals and reactionaries, right? They both see the existing system as being irredeemable, but their answers are significantly different, okay? Where radicals say, let's build something new, reactionaries say, let's go back to the past. And that past is largely imagined. Remember, I gave you the example of ISIS, and ISIS is, I would say, a reactionary group, but the past that they are referring back to, referring to the initial caliphates following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, is almost entirely fictionalized. It is an imagined past, a great and glorious past that didn't really, in factual accounts, exist. So that's the difference between radicalism and reactionary belief. Let me know if you need any further explanation on that, Priyanka. And then the last thing that Priyanka asks about is the difference between cooperative and dual federalism. So this one is available on the Crash Course US Government videos that I had you watch for the project. If you watch the Crash Course US Government video on federalism, it goes over this. Dual federalism is the early system of federalism that existed in the United States between 1788 and I think like 1937, essentially the height of the New Deal. And dual federalism basically drew a very strict line between the power of the national government, that is the federal government, and the power of the United States governments. And it basically gave more power to the states and way less power to the federal government. Dual federalism, the idea of dual federalism is that there are very strict controls over who does what. There's not a lot of blending, and that essentially the national government should be there for national protection, for some taxation, for regulation of commerce, coining of monies, and That's about it. Interstate commerce. That's kind of it. And everything else should go to the states. But that changed radically as a result of the New Deal. The Great Depression was so traumatic in so many ways that it required the development of cooperative federalism. So cooperative federalism is where the federal government starts to become much more powerful, much larger, and it frequently gets states to do things by using the power of money. Essentially, the federal government says, hey, look, states, we will give you money to do these things with regards to education or infrastructure or whatever it is that the federal government wants to achieve. And if you do these things, we will give you money. This is something called grant and aid, and it can be expressed through a couple of different ways. You can get block grants or like project grants or all sorts of different types of grants, but you get pockets of money depending on whether or not you obey what the federal government is asking you to do. And if you don't do what the federal government asks you to do, then you either don't get the money or you can even be punished for it. This is how the states were made to comply with things like desegregation. I mean, like, that is where some of this comes about. Like, if you don't particularly like the notion of cooperative federalism, and many people have problems with it, you also do need to recognize the notion that without cooperative federalism, there would be probably still segregation in public schools in some places, right? That what it took was the federal government intervening in some ways. So that's cooperative federalism. It tends to be associated with a more complex and integrated system of government, one where the federal government and the states' governments are more closely intertwined. The states are largely subordinate to the federal government. Many people don't like that. And the federal government, the national government, is much larger and much more powerful than it used to be. So I hope that helps a little bit, Priyanka. And I think, let me double check. I don't know that I have any more questions coming in through Remind. No, they look like I'm pretty much done there. So I think the only questions I have left are those that are up on chat. So I'm going to answer Harrison's questions and Chike and Ngozi. And then if you have any further questions, feel free to put them into chat or send them via Remind, because we have gone past an hour now. That's really good. But this is usually where you start kind of petering out, and that's okay. But you do need to let me know if you have questions, because once they run out, then I'm going to stop. Okay, so let me take a drink and then I'll get to Harrison's. All right, so Harrison wants to know, in Robert Dahl's theory of pluralism, what would be some reasons for individuals in the political stratum to move into the apolitical stratum? Okay, excellent. So Dahl's essay is really interesting, I think, for a number of reasons, but it is also deeply important that you pay attention to the date of its publication originally, which is in the middle of the 1950s. And that is a long way distant from where we are right now. But Dahl's theory is still resonant in some ways. Essentially, he says what we have are people who are part of the political stratum. That is, people who engage in politics, people who are deeply enmeshed in the political world. They vote, they have political opinions, they maybe attend rallies, they contribute to campaigns. They have a stake in politics. And then you have people who are part of what he calls the apolitical spectrum. And these people, he says, don't really engage in politics on a regular basis. They may or may not vote. And if they do vote, they tend not to think too much about it before they do. He tends to regard these people as less informed. His opinion of them is not particularly high, I don't think. But essentially, what Dahl is positing is that when one feels that the political world already represents one's views, that is, if the people in power are already doing what you want and you are essentially represented in government, you don't really have a need to participate anymore, that you can kind of like tap out because you don't need to engage because you're already there, right? So the apolitical stratum for Dahl can often represent people who don't express political efficacy because they don't think things need to really change, okay? That could be a very different read of things in terms of the apolitical spectrum today. And I also do think it's important to consider the role of race and civil rights at the time of Dahl's writing of this, because One thing that I think Dahl is missing in his argument is the notion that race and gender play a big old role in this. People's sense of political efficacy has a lot to do with whether or not you feel you can change the political status quo. That if you express your opinions, if you vote, if you get involved, you can actually affect change. And for a lot of people in the 1950s, that was not something that they could do. They were systematically disenfranchised, and they were kept out of positions of power. And so as a result, they may have been part of the apolitical stratum. They may not have voted. They may not have gone to meetings or expressed public opinions or written letters to the editor because the system of power that existed was not one that responded to them. And as a result, they become part of that apolitical strata. So I do think that Dahl's argument is important because he sees people, if you're part of the political strata and you achieve what you want to achieve, then maybe you become part of the apolitical strata because you don't need to engage with it on a regular basis. But I also think Dahl is missing a larger picture with regards to the role of minorities, and in a large degree kind of connecting that back to de Tocqueville's idea of the tyranny of the majority, that if the majority is large enough and loud enough, you don't really have to listen to what anybody else thinks, right? Let's see here. Harrison, your second question that you had was, could I explain what foxes and hedgehogs refers to in the Harkness readings vocabulary? Okay, so this is in Louis Menand's article, which is a review of a book, which I am blanking on the title of. It's something about political judgment, by Philip Tetlock. And Tetlock basically says, look, we have experts who make judgments on various things politically, and they make predictions and all sorts of stuff, and often they're wrong. And Tetlock basically says there are two types of people who make political judgments. One he calls hedgehogs and one he calls foxes. And that's actually a reference to a story that shows up in Aristotle way back, like classical Greek times. And basically he says, look, the hedgehog knows one thing and he knows it really well. And there are some political experts who know one thing and they know it really well. And when they are right, they are super right. And when they are wrong, they are terribly wrong. And hedgehogs, he says, Tetlock says, through Menand, says that people who think like hedgehogs, who know one thing, they have one central idea that governs everything that they do, they tend to be wrong more frequently because everything is just based off of that one truth. So a good example of that would be like Churchill. Churchill is a hedgehog's hedgehog. He was wrong about practically everything except for Hitler. He was so right about Hitler and he was so wrong about basically everything else. Whereas you can have political thinkers who are foxes, and foxes don't tend to know anything really well, but instead know a lot of little things about lots of stuff. And they tend to be better judges than hedgehogs do. And essentially what Tetlock is arguing there is he's saying that our talking heads, our experts that we have on cable news and that sort of guide us politically, they tend to be hedgehogs. They tend not to be foxes. And what do we do when experts are wrong? And what is the value of expertise if it means that they're wrong frequently? Okay, so Harrison, I hope that that helps a little bit. Chike wants to know, could I please discuss the behavioral revolution? I actually kind of referenced this a little bit earlier, but I will go over it again. So the behavioral revolution was a shift that occurred in political science in the 1960s and 1970s. And it was the decision to move away from kind of the notion of blanking here, modernization theory, the notion that there's sort of this unquestioning upward swing in political development, almost evolutionary in its role, and that inevitably everybody will move towards a liberal democratic system. The behavioral theory movement that came around in the 1960s said, you know what, human beings are more complicated than that. We have to look at things like the behavior of crowds. We need to look at sociology, psychology. It's important for us to do things like actually do, ethnic studies and understand how race and linguistics play into people's political behaviors. And kind of the behavioral movement really pushed the idea that sometimes people aren't rational actors. Sometimes the decisions we make aren't rational. they're based on other things, and we have to understand that. If we're going to try to understand political behavior or do something like forecast how and why people will vote in an upcoming election, it's not enough for us to just say, well, it makes the most sense for this group to vote this way. We need to think about the complexity of sort of their socioeconomic positioning. We have to understand things about how groups interact and how those social norms and values shape people's decisions. That's what behavioral theory is. That's all. Okay. Let's see here. Ngozi has a question. Do we need to know what factors influence a person's political ideology? What's the difference between implicit rights and explicit? And what are some examples of both? And are they similar to negative and positive rights? Okay. Okay. So do you need to know what factors influence a person's political ideology? Not so much for this unit. For this unit, what you really do need to know about in terms of political ideology is what are the 5 political ideologies that we discussed, okay? Liberalism, communism, social democracy, anarchism, and fascism. You need to be able to fully explain all of those, okay? As to why a person is it leans one way or another, we will get into that a whole lot later on, okay? But no, you don't really need to get into that quite yet. What's the difference between implicit right and explicit? Implicit rights, in particular, when we're talking about the United States Constitution, which is what I am referring to in that particular section, implicit rights are rights that are never fully stated, but are implied. Okay, that includes Fourth Amendment. Fourth Amendment has an implied right to privacy in it, okay, because it talks about search and seizure and it talks about warrants. And in it is the implication that individuals have the right to privacy from the state, that the state can't just jump into your personal life at any given point. This is really important, especially if you consider things like Roe v. Wade and a lot of other major court decisions that rest upon the notion of right to privacy. So that's an implicit right. There's also, I believe, is it the 9th? I'd have to go back and look again. But I believe it's the 9th. If I'm wrong, don't quote me on it. But essentially, I believe the 9th Amendment says that there are other rights out there. They're just not enumerated. They're not listed. So just because we didn't write them down doesn't mean they don't exist, okay? So those are implicit rights. Explicit rights are ones that are specifically stated and worded in the Constitution. The right to bear arms is an explicit right. The right to freedom of speech is an explicit right. Freedom of press is an explicit right. Freedom of assembly is an explicit right. Freedom to redress the government, petition the government for redress of grievances, my apologies, is an explicit right. The fact that you don't have to quarter soldiers in your home, that's an explicit right. So anything that is specifically stated in the Constitution, that is an explicit right. If it's implied, it is between the lines, and that's where we get into a lot of judicial review issues, and we'll get into judicial review later. Are they similar to negative and positive rights? Do I use those terms? I can't remember. I don't think I use those terms on the study guide. Ngozi, is that something that you've talked about in U.S. government? Because I'm just going to say I'm not going to use those terms. I do have a remind question coming in here from Jalen that I'm going to go ahead and answer. Jalen wants to know, is it possible for is it possible for certain informal institutions, for example, Mexico's presidential succession, to become formal with enough encouragement from the public? Oh, okay. All right. So is it possible to transition from an informal political institution to a formal one? Yeah, it would be possible, Jalen. An informal political institution is one that doesn't have, say, the force of law behind it. Okay, so what makes a formal political institution is that there are agreed upon rules that are publicly available. Okay, and those rules could also be laws. So like the existence of a president is established in Article 2 of the US Constitution. So that's a formal political institution. An informal political institution is something that has political weight and power and authority, but doesn't necessarily have an agreed upon written set of rules and can often be operating kind of behind the scenes. All right. Oh gosh, I probably shouldn't use that example. I was going to give you a concurrent event example, but I don't want to get too outwardly political in here. Yeah, like the Mexican presidential system for 80 years only elected presidents from one political party, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the PRI. And as a result of this, it really didn't matter who ran against the PRI. So essentially what would happen is the outgoing president for the PRI would choose who was going to be the next candidate to run for the Partido Revolucionario Institucional. And as a result of that, essentially what that meant was that the outgoing president always got to choose the new president because they were always going to win, and they did for 80 years. And as a result of that, that was an informal political institution. It had bearing and effect on people's political lives. It was not codified in any rule of law. But if you had enough public pressure to maybe alter the way that the political system was run, then yeah, you could write it into law. You could retroactively do that. It's kind of a fuzzy thing because usually informal political institutions are extra legal or illegal. They operate outside the bounds of law. So it would be like deciding that the mafia should be incorporated into government. That can be really, really, kind of illegal. Okay. All right. So is there anyone else who has questions right now? Because I think I have finally reached the end of everybody's questions. No? I'll give you about 10 seconds to respond in chat or to send me something via Remind. But this video will stay up. I don't ever take it down. It stays up there so you can use it all year if you need to. But I hope this was helpful. And remember, tomorrow in class, Dr. Roach and I believe, knock wood, are planning on doing a split day tomorrow, so that I'll see everybody for 45 minutes and we'll do a bit of review in class. On Tuesday, you should plan on the whole class being testing. I'm going to require that you put all of your stuff up front whenever you test, regardless of whether or not you're in my room or Dr. Roach's room. No cell phones out, period, the end, during testing, materials being out, that sort of stuff. And yeah, let me know if you have any further questions. Okay, guys? Seeing no further questions. All right. Have a good evening, guys. And I hope this was helpful. And yeah, go relax for a little bit and I will see you tomorrow. Okay? Bye.